5 minutes ago, Pope Leo XIV makes unexpected decision about Robert Sarah and shocks the Vatican. There were no thrones when it began, no grand papal declaration, no speech from the balcony, no stirring chorus. Just a line buried deep in a 2-page memorandum, unsigned but unmistakably papal. It arrived in the in-trays of certain Vatican dicasteries before dawn, marked only with the words, "The service of truth." In the service of truth. At first, it wasn't even considered newsworthy. Some staffers thought it was a calendar update. Others assumed it was a footnote to an earlier draft of a homily. But by mid-morning, something felt different. The Congregation for Catholic Education had been summoned to an unscheduled meeting, as had the Secretariat for Doctrine, without cameras, without cardinals in public attire, without statements to the press, just silence. And since that silence, something had changed, and everyone knew it had to do with Cardinal Robert Sarah. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel. If you are truly a true Christian, leave in the comments which city you are watching this video from and your name, so that together we can pray for your life. For months, ever since the white smoke signaled the election of Pope Leo XIV, the mood in the Vatican had been one of cautious anticipation. His election was greeted with muted sentiment, polite applause, and carefully curated optimism. He was the safe choice, they said, a man of prayer, not politics, the kind of leader who would preserve peace in a fractured church. No one expected him to rock the boat. They expected continuity, predictability. They were wrong, because while others were waiting for a speech, Leo wrote a rule. And this rule, though brief, fell like a whisper into a silent tomb, but capable of shaking all the centuries. Every seminary in the world with immediate effect would be obliged to institute a new course, not on pastoral care, not on sociology, but on doctrine. Precision in doctrine, clarity in proclamation, not as an academic exercise, but as a spiritual discipline. The memorandum gave no reasons, it gave no arguments, it simply expressed the need. In a world full of noise, the church must not become an echo. It must be a voice, and to be a voice, it must know what it believes. That was all. No media coverage, no photos of the Pope in an office, pen in hand. The Vatican press corps did not even receive a statement. But then a second shock rocked the marble halls. Without fanfare, without ceremony, Leo appointed Cardinal Robert Sarah, the Guinean known for his reverence for the liturgy and his staunch voice in defense of orthodoxy, as his new Secretary of State. The news, delivered in an official statement, as brief as the memorandum, fell like a quiet thunderclap. Sarah, whose reputation preceded him as a contemplative but ultimately faithful pastor, was not the expected choice. In the Vatican, where appointments are often calculated to appease factions, choosing Sarah was seen as a bold move. Progressives whispered that it was a conservative shift, a return to pre-conciliar rigidity. Traditionalists, though initially intrigued, hesitated, for Sarah, despite his orthodoxy, had never been an ideological crusader. "Sarah?" a cardinal murmured in a Curia hallway. "He is too firm for Rome, but too humble for politics." Another replied, "Leo doesn't want politics, he wants purpose." Sarah's appointment shocked everyone because it defied expectations. An African in the Vatican's second most powerful position. A man whose spirituality, shaped by the privations of Guinea and his reading of mystics like St. John of the Cross, seemed untouched by Roman intrigue. Bishops and officials gathered in impromptu meetings, speculating. "It's a message," said one Monsignor, leafing through the memo. "Leo is saying that clarity is non-negotiable." Others worried that Sarah, with his reputation for uncompromising doctrine, would turn Leo's reforms into a crusade that would alienate modern believers. The Pope's lack of explanation only heightened the unease. While the Vatican whispered, Sarah, in his first public appearance as Secretary of State, simply quoted his own work. Truth is not a burden, it is an anchor. And then there was silence. The shock was reverberating, but the work had only just begun. And you, what do you think about Robert Sarah's appointment? Is he really too strict or not? Leave your opinion in the comments. News of the memorandum and Sarah's appointment spread, first among the curia, then among the bishops, then silently among the seminarians, who read the leaked document with wide eyes and dry mouths. Questions came quickly. Was it a condemnation of modern training programs, a crackdown on theological flexibility, the beginning of a doctrinal hardening that alienated the younger generation? Pope Leo never responded. He did not issue any clarifications, nor did he explain himself on Vatican radio. Instead, he walked to the chapel that night and said Vespers in silence, his only company the flicker of candlelight and the echo of ancient psalms. Sarah, beside him, bowed her head, her breviary open in her hands. Yet the Vatican whispered, "It is not like the previous one. It is stricter than it seems. It is not only clear, it is resolute." And Sarah's name, now linked to Leo's, became the epicenter of this murmur. The following week, another memorandum arrived, this one addressed to bishops' conferences around the world, asking each bishop to submit, within 3 months, a confidential report outlining any areas of doctrinal ambiguity within his diocese. There was no mention of sanctions, no threats, just a request for clarity, rooted in pastoral concern. But everyone knew what it meant. Something was happening. The papacy, long perceived as reactive, was moving again, not noisily, not with fanfare, but with purpose. It was not reform by rupture, it was something older, deeper, reform by remembrance. And at the center of this reform was Robert Sarah, now Leo's right-hand man. In a private audience in the Apostolic Palace, Leo summoned Sarah, not to delegate tasks, but to share a vision. "Robert," the Pope said, his voice low as the crackling of candles, "the world is tired of echoes. The Church must be a voice." Sarah, her eyes fixed on a crucifix on the wall, nodded. He shared a memory from his youth in Guinea, where Catholic communities under persecution held onto the faith because priests spoke clearly, even under threat. "They had no books, Holy Father," Sarah said, "but they had the truth, and that was enough." Leo listened silently, then replied, "Then help me to return that truth to our seminaries, to our churches, to our sheep." Sarah approached the task with the gravity of a monk. As Secretary of State, he wrote to bishops' conferences, urging the bishops to respond to Leo's call with honesty. His letters, written with the precision of a theologian and the soul of a pastor, echoed Leo's memorandum. "Clarity is not cruelty, it is charity. We do not speak to condemn, but to guide." But his appointment continued to shock. In Rome, a progressive cardinal muttered in a closed meeting, "Sarah is shaping Leo's agenda. This is an inquisition in disguise." By contrast, an African bishop wrote to a colleague, "For the first time, Rome is listening to the peripheries. Sarah is one of us." The shock was not just about doctrine, it was about who now carried the Pope's voice. Meanwhile, some were restless, because it is easy to settle down when the lines are blurred, easy to keep the peace when no one speaks in absolutes. But Leo, with Sarah at his side, had begun to redraw the lines, not to exclude but to make visible what had faded, not by shouting but by whispering where it hurt most. And those whispers, amplified by Sarah's authority, echoed in seminaries from Krakow to Kinshasa. Administrators began holding emergency meetings with faculty. Professors, who had long relied on ambiguity, began to unpack texts they had not taught in years. Catechisms replaced printed packets. Scriptures were taught with conviction again, not because it was fashionable, but because it was the time. A rector in São Paulo told his students, "We are not entering a new era. We are re-entering what we have forgotten. In Boston, a young seminarian sent a message to his mother. It feels as if something sacred has just been awakened. In Manila, a theology professor quietly resigned. In Germany, a bishop publicly objected. The church must not retreat into rigidity, he said. Leo did not respond, but Sarah, in a homily in a Roman chapel, spoke softly. Rigidity is a fear of truth. Clarity is a love of it. He did not need to say more, because this was not about ideology, it was about identity. He was not trying to fight culture wars, he was trying to heal confusion, and clarity, when spoken softly, often cuts deeper than any shout. He knew it, Sarah knew it, and together they began to move the church. Do you believe that this partnership with Pope Leo is right? Leave your opinion here in the comments. It was not the decree they had been waiting for. There were rumors, of course, as there always are. Some predicted radical liturgical changes, others warned of disciplinary crackdowns, and a few expected or feared an encyclical that would redraw the battle lines in the church. But when the document finally arrived, hand-delivered to each, dicastery and quietly distributed to bishops' conferences around the world, it contained no condemnations, no outrages, no anathemas. It began with a sentence so measured that it almost went unnoticed. Food for the soul requires not only the warmth of accompaniment, but the clarity of truth. The document, titled Truth is Charity, Truth in Charity, was only 16 pages long, but it spread throughout the church with the force of something much greater, not because it changed doctrine, but because it asked why so many had stopped teaching it. At the heart of the decree were two mandates. First, every seminary in every region was to restore systematic instruction in dogmatic theology, not as an elective, not as a historical artifact, but as a pillar of priestly formation. Every candidate for ordination was to be able to articulate with confidence the central teachings of the Church, not just propose pastoral responses to them. Second, bishops' conferences were instructed to submit written reports, identifying areas of doctrinal confusion within their territories. These reports were not optional, they were not symbolic. They were the beginning of something more, a reckoning, born not of punishment but of truth. Robert Sarah, now Leo's right-hand man, was tasked with overseeing the implementation. He traveled to seminaries, starting in Nairobi, where he preached. To a room full of young people, the liturgy is where truth breathes. Without clarity and doctrine, our worship becomes an empty echo. His words, shared by seminarians on social media, spread quickly. But the shock of his appointment lingered. In European theological colleges, professors accused Sarah of imposing a backward-looking vision, while in Asian and African dioceses, his presence was celebrated as a sign that the global church was being heard. A theologian in Paris murmured, "Sarah is taking the church back to the past." A bishop in Lagos responded, "No, he's taking us to the center." The reaction was immediate. Some bishops welcomed the decree with open arms. Finally, one said, someone has the courage to ask the right questions. Others were skeptical, unsure of what to do with the data, and a few, behind closed doors, expressed acute concern. "This looks like surveillance," a cardinal muttered, "a gentle inquisition." But Leo, through Sarah, never used the language of inspection. He used the language of integrity. "Faith," Sarah wrote in a circular to the dioceses, "is not a labyrinth, it is a light." That line circulated like wildfire among priests, seminarians, and lay people alike, not because it was provocative, but because it named what many had silently felt, that at some point the church had begun to speak with. Many voices, compassionate, yes, but contradictory. And we on the benches were left alone to recognize the differences. The impact of the decree, amplified by Sarah's leadership, began to be felt. In Krakow, a seminary overnight restructured its curriculum, bringing back texts from Thomas Aquinas. In Kinshasa, catechism teachers began teaching with a conviction they had forgotten. In São Paulo, a rector told seminarians, "We are not inventing the faith, we are rediscovering it." But not everyone welcomed the change. In Germany, a bishop publicly declared that the church could not regress into rigidity. In response, Sarah, speaking at a conference in Rome, calmly said, "Rigidity is fear of the truth. Clarity is love of it." Her words, broadcast live, echoed in parishes far away. Still, Sarah was struggling with an inner conflict. In a private letter to Leo, he confessed, "I fear that my voice, so associated with orthodoxy, will turn your call into a crusade that divides rather than unites." Leo responded with a handwritten note, "Robert, the truth does not divide, it invites. Stand by me, not to fight, but to pray." This exchange strengthened Sarah, who organized a retreat for bishops in Assisi, where his humility disarmed critics. "We are not here to condemn," he said, "but to remember who we are." The retreat, widely reported, began to change the perception that Sarah was merely a rigid conservative. He was, above all, a pastor. The global impact was growing. In Boston, a seminarian wrote to his mother, "It feels as if something sacred has awakened." In Manila, a teacher resigned, unable to come to terms with the new clarity. In Nairobi, a group of catechists formed a movement called Voice of Truth, inspired by Sarah. But the shock of his appointment lingered. A fictional article titled "The African Who Shook Rome" circulated on Catholic blogs, highlighting how Sarah's Guinean origins challenged the Vatican's Eurocentrism. Some Western theologians protested, fearing a return to rigidity, but in peripheral dioceses, Sarah was seen as a symbol of hope. Lyon, meanwhile, he remembered the woman who had inspired him years before, when he was just an archbishop. She had left the church, exhausted by its ambiguity. "I no longer knew what to believe." That memory, shared with Sarah in a late-night conversation, became the core of their partnership. "Robert," Leo said, "we are not reforming to control. We are reforming so that no one will ever feel tired of guessing." Sarah nodded, her eyes reflecting the weight of her mission. He knew that clarity, when spoken with love, was not cruelty, it was charity. He was standing at the lectern, his hands folded, his voice low. It was not a day of celebration, it was not broadcast. There were no global press briefings, no papal photographers positioned at dramatic angles. Just a Sunday morning liturgy in a parish, hidden within the city walls. The kind of place pilgrims rarely visit, where the marble is chipped and the candles are always lit half an hour early by a widow named Maria. And yet it was here, with Robert Sarah concelebrating at his side, that Pope Leo spoke the words that crossed the oceans at dusk. The gospel reading had been from Matthew. "May your yes mean yes, and your no mean no," a line that is often overlooked, not this time. After reading, Leo stepped forward, no notes, no manuscript. He looked across the pews, children shifting in their seats, an elderly man adjusting his hearing aid, a teenager checking the cracked screen of his phone. Ordinary faces, ordinary lives. Then he said, "In a world that no longer knows what a word means, let us be people who mean what we say." Silence, not the heavy kind that falls when people aren't sure what to make of a statement. The holy kind, the kind that breaks something and leaves the air cleaner than it was before. Sarah, standing next to Leo, handed him an old breviary from her home diocese in Guinea, a simple gesture that symbolized the union between universal tradition and voices from the peripheries. The image of the two of them together, captured by a churchgoer on a cell phone, spread like wildfire. Before the final hymn was over, a theology student in the back seat posted the quote, "It spread within seconds." A pastor in Nigeria read it aloud before his homily that night. A priest in Chicago had it printed in his parish bulletin the next day. A catechist in Slovenia turned it into a classroom banner. Within hours, it was on T-shirts, Twitter posts, WhatsApp chains, and chalkboards, in a world that no longer knows what a word means. Let's be people who mean what we say. Sarah, in a brief homily after Leo, added, "The Church does not speak to win, it speaks to save." Her words, joined with Leo's, touched the lawyer drowning in spin, the teacher exhausted by euphemisms, the father trying to raise children in a fog of contradictions, the soul yearning for something solid. Because Leo and Sarah were not speaking only of the Church, they were speaking of all of us. And they were not issuing a challenge, they were giving permission. Permission to speak clearly, to love boldly, to return to the language of truth, not to win arguments, but to heal what had been fractured by ambiguity. If you are watching, please like the video so that together we can spread this transformative message. But not everyone greeted the reforms with enthusiasm. At theological colleges in Paris and Louvain, professors published articles criticizing what they called a return to rigidity. One influential theologian, speaking at a symposium in Frankfurt, declared, "Sarah and Leo are building a church of museum, not of mission." In Rome, a group of progressive cardinals met in secret, fearing that Sarah's appointment would signal a silent purge of moderate voices. One murmured, "This is not clarity, it is control." Meanwhile, in traditionalist circles, some celebrated Sarah as a hero, but others questioned whether his humility would prevent him from taking the reforms to the extreme they desired. The shock of his appointment continued to make waves, dividing opinion and testing loyalties. Sarah, aware of the tensions, responded not with polemics, but with action. He organized a regional synod in Assisi, inviting bishops from around the world to discuss the implementation of the truth is charity. In his opening address, he spoke with the calm of a monk. Truth is not a weapon to divide, it is a bridge to unite. We do not ask for uniformity, we ask for fidelity. His words, broadcast live, touched many but not all. A European bishop in a closed session challenged Sarah, "How can we speak of clarity without alienating young people who seek a welcoming church?" Sarah responded with a story from her youth in Guinea. "When I was a boy, the church gave me truth, not vague promises, and it gave me hope, not exclusion." The audience fell silent, and even critics recognized the strength of her conviction. Outside the Vatican, reforms began to take shape. In Bogotá, a seminary launched a course called Doctrine and Discipleship, inspired by Sarah's letters. In Manila, a group of lay people formed a catechesis movement based on the truth is charity, distributing pamphlets with Sarah's quote, "Clarity is charity." But resistance persisted. In one German diocese, a group of priests published an open letter warning against what they called imposed orthodoxy. Sarah, rather than responding directly, traveled to the diocese, celebrating a simple mass and preaching, "The Church is not a democracy of ideas, it is a family of faith, and a family speaks with one voice." Her presence, at once firm and humble, disarmed some critics, but deepened the discomfort of others. The initial shock of Sarah's appointment evolved into a larger question. Could the Church find unity without sacrificing diversity? Sarah, in a rare interview with Vatican Radio, addressed the issue. Unity does not mean silence about the truth. It means speaking the truth with love. Her words, echoing the spirit of Leo, began to change the narrative. In peripheral dioceses, from Kampala to La Paz, bishops began to embrace the reforms with enthusiasm, inspired by Sarah's African leadership. One priest in Nairobi told his parishioners, "Sarah shows us that the Church does not belong to Rome alone. It belongs to all of us." And so the waves of resistance began to subside, not by coercion, but by the quiet force of clarity. As the months passed, the church began to change, not with fanfare, but with a steady pulse. In Nigeria, a bishop who had avoided controversy for years walked into a packed cathedral and said plainly, "Sin hurts, grace heals, and both are real." The crowd applauded, not because they agreed, but because someone had finally spoken bluntly. In Argentina, a young priest opened his catechism before a youth group saying, "We are no longer guessing, we are anchoring." In Vietnam, during a diocesan retreat, a bishop known for his caution quoted Sarah, "It is not fear, it is fire. Fire to see clearly, fire to speak with conviction." The partnership between Leo and Sarah became a symbol. In Rome, a fictitious article titled "The Pope and the Shepherd" circulated, describing how Sarah's humility complemented Leo's vision. In a small monastery in Spain, an abbot wrote to Rome, "Sarah is not just a cardinal, she is a sign that the church is listening to the whole world." In seminaries, curricula changed, not to exclude, but to root. In Nairobi, a course called Truth in the Age of Noise was launched, inspired by a homily by Sarah. A once reluctant professor opened the semester by saying, "Ambiguity never saved a soul. Clarity is mercy." Not everyone embraced the change. At Western theological schools, internal memos defended existing curricula, fearing a backlash. But the pulse continued. In Belgium, a diocese published a revised catechetical guide, stripped of euphemisms and rich in scripture. One priest joked, "It reads as if we really believed something." In Brazil, seminarians formed study groups to proclaim, not debate, with the motto, "Tell it as if it were true." And in Rome, Leo and Sarah watched, prayed, let the wave unfold, because they knew it was not about policy, but about posture. Priests who had whispered rediscovered the courage to speak out. Bishops who had avoided difficult topics now faced them not as warriors, but as fathers. The church did not remain silent because it had nothing to say. They were silent because they forgot how to say it. Leo and Sarah did not give a new script. They gave back their language. And the final question, hanging in the air, was simple. Will we follow or will they fade away? Thank you for being here, for listening, for reflecting with me. If these words resonate with you, don't keep them to yourself. Behave them. Live. In them, let them be a spark in the darkness. See you next time, where we will continue searching together for that clear voice that not only speaks, but transforms. Until then, may truth guide you and hope sustain you. I want to know your opinion. What did you think of this great news? If you love the Pope, subscribe to the channel and leave a message of support here in the comments. Share this video with 5 loved ones in your life. Until tomorrow.